morning, Black New Mexico, and welcome to another podcast, Living While Black in the season of COVID-19. My name is Jim Harvey. I'm with the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as one of the facilitators for these podcasts. Just so you know, this is the last in this particular series of podcasts, and we urge you, and I'll mention this again at the end, we urge you, if you believe that these have been helpful and enjoyable and informative, to contact the state of New Mexico, contact the governor's office, and let them know that you want more. We want to thank the magnificent team at the incredible Office of African American Affairs for having the foresight to bring this podcast to you, particularly during this really difficult and struggling time, particularly for African Americans in New Mexico. And we thank the state of New Mexico for making this possible. We have an exciting program for you today. And before we get into that, just a quick announcement. We have a food giveaway today from 12 noon to 2 p.m. at New Hope Full Gospel Church, Full Gospel Baptist Church at 1901 Pennsylvania Avenue Northeast. That's right on the corner of Indian School and Pennsylvania Northeast. So that's from 12 o'clock to 2 p.m. today. So if you are in need of some food assistance, please go by New Hope Full Gospel Baptist Church. All right, as always, let's go to the illustrious and the most informed health professional that I've come to know as of late, our own Sonia Smith. Sonia?
Good morning. I'm going to miss that, Jim, but hopefully this is just a pause and we will be back. So thank you so very much. So let me just give you some updates. So as of today, we have 11,809 positive cases here in the state. We've tested over 330,000 people across the state. That is quite impressive. We have 492 deaths, but as we always like to say, the good news is we have over 5,264 people who have recovered. And if we want to get more granular, we have 228 positive cases for people who identify as Black or African. So since June 8th, we have had an increase in our cases by 2,869. We've had an increase of 96 deaths. We've had 1,957 people who have recovered. We've had an increase in positive cases among folks who identify as Black or African American of 36 cases. And we've tested since June 8th, 96,000 more people. So I just wanted to share that because I know that numbers are important. Also to remind people that the coronavirus is still live and active, and to continue to do all the safety precautions that the Department of Health have asked us to do. So thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for that. Thank you very much. And remember that even though we are hearing about slow and cautious openings in certain areas, universal precautions, social distancing, wearing your mask, making as little contact as possible with the outside world are still the best ways to protect you and protect others from the coronavirus. So nothing has changed in that respect. So let's not get happy. Let's continue to be safe. We've got an interesting program, an exciting program for you today, and I think it's just very appropriate that we have this presentation to close out this particular series. And it is entitled The Black Legal Experience During COVID-19. Our presenter is Professor and Dr. Sonia Gibson Rankin. Sonia Gibson Rankin is an assistant professor of law at the University of New Mexico School of Law. She teaches in the fields of torts, constitutional law, family law, and race and the law. Professor Gibson Rankin's research issues related to race, law, and technology. Before joining the UNM School of Law faculty, Professor Gibson Rankin served as the Associate Dean for Curriculum and Program Development in the University College as a senior lecturer in Africana Studies. Both at the university and the University of New Mexico. So all this happened at the University of New Mexico. Professor Gibson Rankin has served as a family mediator, legal advisor, and as a charter school trustee, and has served on the statewide higher education committees and regularly presents on kinship care, mass incarceration, and race and gender equity before universities, civil rights, and public policy conferences. Professor Gibson Rankin is currently the faculty advisor for the Intellectual Property Society and the Black Law Student Association at the UNM School of Law. She is treasurer of the New Mexico Black Lawyers Association and a member of the State Bar of New Mexico on Professionalism, the New Mexico Committee on Diversity, and director of the Women's United Ministry at Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've heard this woman speak. She's got a lot to say, and I give you Sonia Gibson Rankin. Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for giving me in the warning that I might talk too fast. But no, so I'm so excited and honored for this opportunity to gather with colleagues and friends and in our community. And I am going to share some information with you that's pertinent to the legal experience that many are going through. Just so you know, at the end of this presentation, all of my slides will be shared with the Office of African American Affairs so that you guys can do with it as you please and kind of get access to some of the legal resources that are available. So I'm going to cover some general topics. I'm so thankful for this time to chat with you. And it is kind of a summation of all the great presentations that the office has put together this past season for us. Scott Crothers has long been a very good friend of mine, and I am grateful for so many of the great staff that he has and that he had that oversaw the creation of this program for New Mexico and the Black experience. So to just kind of let you know, I'm going to be giving some generally large topics as it relates to the legal community in New Mexico, the Black experience in New Mexico, the legal concerns of Blacks in New Mexico that also can apply in some broader spaces. And I'll also be giving a list of resources. So let's jump into it. I want to start, of course, with a huge thank you to Ms. Pamela Herndon, the CEO of the KWH Law Center for Social Justice and Change. She helped me create and craft this presentation to be able to share some really critical points with you. And this really came to mind as I started thinking about this topic over the last couple of months of preparing for it, is that you'll notice, these are the list of things I want to cover with you today, but you'll notice that although there's a different reason, they're the same struggles. You know, that we could change this instead of being COVID-19 and just say it's a cloudy day, right? That we're still going to discover that there are some unique ways that living as a Black person in the state of New Mexico in the United States has a particular impact that doesn't apply and impact other communities. So different reason, COVID-19, global pandemic, same struggles. And these are the things I'd like to talk about. Access to medical care, voting, profiling, incarceration, housing and eviction, employment, education, and domestic violence. So to start with, and I thank you to Sonia Smith for giving us these numbers, and I just saw them this morning also. As of today, 11,809 confirmed positive cases of COVID-19 in New Mexico. And I thought that this chart really spoke, and the reason I'm going to present very little medical information, but it's really to help you understand how the law thinks about what we're going through and what the law argues or is weighing or balancing in terms of a lot of different issues. So these are what is argued, right? We have 11,809 confirmed cases, and there are different kinds of risks associated with your potential or likelihood or probability of catching and becoming infected with COVID-19. Low risk, medium risk, and high risk. And this is going to be a big issue because a lot of what happens in the law, a lot of the laws that we have historically been connected to this idea that there are risks that the law has to balance. So you've already covered this, and hopefully there's a chance to think about this a little broader, but the physical impact of COVID-19, short term, that your lung tissue swells with fluid, your immune system actually turns all the way up, right? It knows something's happening and it turns up as high as it can to the point where it is shutting down, could shut down your other organs. And as your body is fighting this infection, it can lead to additional infections that can occur. These are the short-term things that we're seeing. The long-term impact are these ideas of potentially limited lung capacity, kidney complications, blood clotting, strokes, embolisms, heart damage. And although 80% of cases, people that will test positive, are mild or asymptomatic, we're now starting to discover that there are long-term physical and neurological impacts appearing in people that have recovered from COVID-19. Why do I say all of that? Why do I include that? Because we're talking about a disease and a condition that turns people's blood to glue and jello. I say it so broad, so kind of bluntly, because I want you to have a sense of that it's not just this nebulous thing in the air, but it has a particular type of outcome that we're looking at. And so the law is going to have to think about and balance, what do we do with the idea that there is a disease or a condition that will turn people's blood to glue, but not everyone is going to get this disease. So where do we start with? Well, this is where we start to think about it as it relates to the Black community. And as I said, different cause, same struggle. Preliminary research is showing that Black people who are visiting hospitals, this is back in back in February and March, when they first began presenting with symptoms, hospitals were turning them away, specifically because they were Black. Now, they're not going to say that directly, but we know that there was built-in racial bias in determining who was at risk and who wasn't. And I am concerned about this issue in particular because, like many of you, I've had extended family members and people that I know who have tested positive for the virus, and I even know people who have passed away from the virus and from complications related to having this virus. This is not a far away kind of topic. And so I'll let you know right up front, my biases are, what can we do to keep more Black people alive? Right, that's going to be of grave concern to me. But our research is showing that doctors and medical professionals, we're not seeing Black people's symptoms as critical as for others and would turn them away. What are your legal rights within that space? Well, it's going to be the same thing that people have always had, right? Which is your argument to the hospital that they were negligent, that they failed to provide care, failed to provide proper care. But that gets a little bit tricky because we are going to be balancing that with the same kind of arguments that people have presented in the past. This next one is the idea of voting and protecting your right to vote. In New Mexico, we are one of the few states where you do not need a stamp in order to vote, to register to vote. And the big legal issues that people are watching for in the state of New Mexico, because we have some different laws as it relates to absentee voting, everyone is eligible to vote absentee. And I'll have a link for where you can go to get that information. But we are still going to be looking at concerns related to coercion in terms of that absentee ballot. So when the ballot arrives to your home, who's required to get that ballot? How do they get the ballot? How do we protect it from the person who's filling it out to the submission of it? and whether you're required to show your ballot by your home or your workplace or your nursing home that you're in before they will mail it for you. And so there are fears and concerns of coercion in terms of your vote remaining private, your vote remaining free and uninhibited by other people. And just in terms of deadlines related to this, I want you to have two major points in the back of your head. That request for the fall needs to be done 30 days in advance of the election. So the elections is November 4th. You need to make sure that you have requested an absentee ballot 30 days in advance, and it has to be there by election day, not postmarked. So this is the old school mailbox rule, but you want to make sure that it has been received. Now, you'll notice the image in the back has an I voted with a question mark. There, you might be concerned, how do you know if your ballot has been received, if it actually was completed? You're going to want to double check and make sure that your signature that is on file is the signature that you currently have today. We have watched across the country of rises in COVID-19 cases because of people being required to be in person to vote. We saw reports in Texas of 8-hour-long waits from 6 a.m. People started at that point already having to wait 8 hours. We have already know that there are a lot of rigged voting machines or hacked or hackable voting machines in Georgia or in other jurisdictions where the voting machines just stay tied up and are never actually put into circulation for use by the people. So this is a big issue across the country, but in New Mexico, these are the things I want you to be thinking about and being aware to contact colleagues and friends and loved ones to ensure that they're able to vote free without coercion. Now, in terms of profiling, this is kind of one of the first issues that was raised to me in terms of thinking about this presentation, wearing a mask while Black. And I came across some information, and hopefully you can see these images, but I thought they were really telling. The first image is a gentleman who was at a store in Illinois. And while he was at the store, he was actually told to leave the store because he was wearing a mask, that it was seen that he looked suspect while wearing a mask. In the middle is a tweet by Representative Cam Buckner of Ohio, who went into a store shortly after COVID-19 and the global pandemic and quarantine went into effect. And while he was wearing a mask in the store, dressed as other people in the store, a police officer came to him and said these things: "People are using the coronavirus to do bad things. I couldn't see your face, man. You looked like you were up to something." This third picture is in Philadelphia, where, and that's why this quote really stood out to me: "I want to stay alive, but I also want to stay alive." And what many Black people discover is that wearing a mask can lead to you being profiled. But if I don't wear the mask, I might be more likely to have comorbidity and other medical complications that will make me more susceptible to dying from coronavirus and from COVID-19. And this was a gentleman in Philadelphia being forcibly forced off of a train because he didn't have a mask. And his reasoning was, "I didn't feel safe that law enforcement would not bother me if I was wearing a mask." So these are very heavy weighing concerns related, of course, to profiling, to all of the things that are even more long-term than what we've watched happen to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but just that the requirement to wear a mask in public or not wear a mask in public actually has a different impact on Black Americans because of the long history of police brutality and people feeling empowered to call and use law enforcement as their own personal security team against Black Americans. The next topic that has really stood out to me has been the information related to essential employment. Not getting top pay, not getting hazard pay. The major concerns that as we look at who is employed and required to be out in the physical workforce as opposed to being able to work from home. And it's been revealed to many of us that we've known for a long time that the social safety net in the United States is not strong at all. That there are people that are going to lack critical health insurance, that they will lack unemployment insurance, and the 40 million plus people who have had to file for unemployment benefits and resources, many of them will be low pay wage workers and not on a mass scale, that they're going to be disproportionately impacted. And we also know that there are very few workplace safety measures in place to ensure that there are protected spaces for people. And so I came across this research that I wanted to share with you from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it really stood out to me. WFH stands for work from home, for the work from home divide. And unemployment is lower for industries with higher remote work abilities. And you can think about your own workplaces and where they fall. The line on top, which is black, versus the light blue line, which is the April 2020 unemployment rates. And you'll notice that there's a disproportionately, the lower that there's work from home opportunities, the higher the unemployment went back in April of 2020. So we discovered that when Congress allowed for $2 trillion of funds, much of it did not go to direct people, but did go to businesses for an idea and mechanisms for ways for them to keep people employed, to keep people able to receive either payment or to stay employed, continue to have access to health insurance. And I found this to be really concerning because what we know is that a disproportionate number of Black people will fall into a lot of these industries where people did not have abilities to work from home. And so that raises the question of what if my workplace is not safe? And I wanted to present a lot of the concerns, and you'll notice at the bottom a formula, and this is for me to nerd out a little bit on legal education and in the space of law school training. But in the legal community, there's a formula taught from a case called U.S. versus Carroll Towing, and it's a 1947 case, and Judge Learned Hand presents this formula. B is less than P times L. And this is a formula that nobody likes but me because I like the math added into the law. But it's really this idea that if the burden of precaution is less than the probability of injury times the resulting injury, we would then hold a workplace or whomever causes the negligent action liable for negligence. So just to kind of think about it, how much of a burden, what is the burden of a workplace staying closed as a precaution against the likelihood that a person might contract a disease that will turn their blood to glue, right? That's really what we're after. And what you're probably already realizing is, well, it comes down to, some can argue that it comes to, if that workplace closes to keep people safe, that workplace may never open again. And we've already watched the number of places throughout our city and throughout the state that have had to close because they could not economically stay open. But is that burden of closing, which is typically an economic argument, worth the probability of injury, right? So now we have to think about the probability of injury. And that's why I started with the stats and kind of what is the likelihood that a person is going to contract coronavirus. That's the probability of injury. Now we want to amplify that, multiply that by the actual harm, the resulting injury that would occur. That's the L. So that gets us to this idea of how bad is it for a person to contract coronavirus or become infected with COVID-19? Well, that's what businesses and companies are weighing, and they are moving rapidly fast to come up with ways to protect companies from the any behavior that could lead to potential liability from employees. And so what we're already discovering in the legal space are a lot of attorneys who are working very diligently on behalf of companies to ensure that they can invoke force clauses to require people to come to work for contractual obligations, that don't allow employers to avoid obligations for wage and hour compliance, that are coming up with measures and mechanisms to protect companies that force a person to return to work. There's a bill, Senate Bill 308 in Ohio, where they were working to ensure that all Ohio businesses would be immune from any liability whatsoever. Negligence, wrongful termination due to COVID-19. So an individual employee's opportunity to say, I don't feel safe going to the workplace, or you have not presented enough ways that you're going to work to keep me safe, would not be sufficient, because businesses could be immune from any liability. And also in Louisiana, once again, this is also going forward with virus liability shields to shield businesses from any lawsuits from employees or customers who contract COVID-19 in the absence of federal liability protection. So when you start to think about how things can happen at a very local level and how it extrapolates at a larger space, because the federal government has not moved on liability protections, it allows states to go forward and have local and state rules that would not protect individuals who feel that their workplace is not safe. And we know that this will disproportionately impact Black Americans in our state and throughout the country, as they will not often or may not fall into particular kind of categories, whether they're not part of a collective bargaining unit with their workplace that would have been advocating for these protections from people, and whether the workplace has said, we told you to wear masks, I don't know how you still got sick, it must be your fault. Employers are required to and have a responsibility to provide a safe and healthful workplace. But of course, there are limits as to what is considered within the boundaries or responsibilities of an employer. So an employer might be able to argue that we tried, right? But we're going to still be looking at foreseeable harm for foreseeable plaintiffs. Is it foreseeable that a person who's required to return to the workplace, even if they're wearing a mask and gloves and taking longer breaks and are required to wipe down their facility, could still potentially contract this disease? Once again, it comes back to the formula to think about. And this stood out to me because employees across the country are starting to ask this question in terms of working to get and be protected. And I really like this image, because just because a person is essential does not make them expendable in terms of not providing enough safety and protections for people. So we've already watched on the news that Amazon workers are suing over viruses brought home from their warehouse. There's a group of Amazon employees who are arguing that the working conditions are just not safe, even though the company has said that they've tried to put in protections. A lawsuit against McDonald's Corporation of whether using public nuisance to force employers to keep them safe from the coronavirus. So there's arguments of what are some different rationales that could be used. Connecting, and this is going to be very interesting to study, that if a workplace has lead paint or has environmental pollution or other kinds of harms, what are their responsibilities to protect an employee? And could a coronavirus global pandemic, COVID-19, be used as a way to force employers to come up with better safety protections? Now, this last one is a bit interesting in terms of masks at work for workers who don't want to wear mandatory face coverings. And like I said, I am a bit biased on this because of knowing people who have either contracted the disease or passed away from it, that I personally am just like, wear the mask. It's super uncomfortable. Maybe it fogs up your glasses. Maybe you don't wear foundation anymore. Wear the mask. That is my own personal view. But there are people that are advocating and arguing that it is against their civil liberties and their right to privacy and their right to control of one's own body. And can your employer require you to do something to your physical body while at work? And so we're still watching what is going to happen in terms of these mandatory safety measures. Can refusing to wear a mask justify a termination if it's part of your requirement for your job? And so something I want to remind people to do when they're thinking, is there something happening at my workplace where I don't feel safe? A very good friend of mine shared a video yesterday of a woman who was very frustrated at her workplace because they made everyone immediately leave the building after they had discovered that an employee had tested positive for coronavirus. And the woman's response of why they were told to return to work, although there were a number of safety protections not in place, is the employer said, we don't want you to get out of the habit of working. And that is the kind of language that should cause concern to any person, because people want to work. In fact, most people want to be employed. Most people want to earn their own living, whether it's their own business or working for someone else or creating new opportunities. But this notion that we're forcing people to go to work so that they don't get out of the habit of work really rankles. And it harkens back to language that we're familiar with that is typically and often used against Black Americans in stereotypical ways. So I raise this to people that are wondering, is my workplace safe? Do I have enough protections? Are they thinking about me? Familiarize yourself with state and local paid sick leave laws. Do I have the right to say, I do not feel safe? Remember the FMLA and similar state laws related to it. FMLA stands for Family Medical Leave Act. And certain places of employment, typically with over 50 employees, are required to follow federal laws related to medical leave that give you the right to either take unpaid leave for yourself or for a person that you are a caregiver for, typically a spouse or dependents or your parents. So remember your access to federal protections. Familiarize yourself with ADA limitations. And this is one that or ADA options. So if you are a person, and the CDC has put out a new list of potential people or individuals with certain conditions that could lead to exacerbated higher risk of contracting the disease, regardless of masks and gloves and 6 feet of physical separation, that there could still be arguments that could be made that you are at a physical disability that is legally protected under legal requirements, which is different than FMLA. And review wage payment obligations. Your employer could be required to still pay you even if you are unable to come to the workplace because of these things. And so I bring these up to you because I don't want anyone to feel that you're without recourse. Companies are working very diligently to protect themselves, and individuals should be working just as critically to ensure that their workplace is working to make it as safe as possible, and that you are not impacted by unlawful termination. The next topic that kind of stood out to me is related to education. And in terms of thinking about education, it's really interesting to me. We already know, and some of you who have been kind of following this have watched the Albuquerque Public Schools list of suspensions and expulsions. And you'll notice that though Black New Mexicans account for about 2.9% of the population, or about 2.9% of the Albuquerque population, we account for 4.4% of suspensions. We're suspended at almost twice our rate of our children actually in school. And so I wondered, with the last 8 weeks of all children being taught from home and remotely, did we see a reduction in suspensions? Did teachers still find ways to argue that students were in some kind of trouble? And I say that a little tongue in cheek because as our children are not in schools, they're not potentially being subject to suspension or expulsion, but they are at a limit in terms of Yazzie versus Martinez. This is a New Mexico case where the Supreme Court required that New Mexico had to teach, in particular, Native American children and ensure that they are getting a good, actual, true education. So I asked this question, are we learning? And so in Albuquerque in particular, and throughout the state, in Albuquerque in particular, we know that there were tens of thousands of Chromebooks delivered or made available for students, that hotspots were made available throughout the city where people could go and use public hotspots in order for their children to be online. But we have other complications to think about, right? So I have a hotspot, but as anyone knows, if there's a strong wind in our city, the internet will go out in some kind of a way. Was the electricity turned off because of the family not having access to funds to pay the bills? Were they able to contact and get waivers so that their electricity wouldn't be turned off, so that internet is not turned off? And there are still places that are so remote that even the very best hotspots don't work very critically. And we know that there are students all throughout the state who run into this concern. We're already watching now that this access to technology is having a particular impact, and college tests are called unfair because of potentially homebound tech poor students. In fact, I heard from people right here in Albuquerque that during the AP exams, the internet went out while students were taking their test here in Albuquerque. So in terms of advanced placement tests, we watched a lot of universities say they're not going to be requiring ACT or SAT scores, but every day that a person has less strong connectivity with their technology is another day that the student is falling behind in their educational space that has been created. And if a family has more than one child, do they receive enough Chromebooks for all of the children to be in school at the same time? If there's a special needs child in the household that took or has more response, that the family might have to put more attention towards, were they not able to make sure that all of the children in the house were getting the type of education that they would hope for? So this access to technology is still a big concern for the Black community. The next topic I wanted to think about was incarceration. And this, of course, is with COVID-19 really raised a lot of interest or concern because of the potential breeding ground that our prisons and jails would be for the spread of COVID-19. And we already saw that. Maybe many of you saw it on the news this morning about a facility in New Mexico where the rate is 80% of people who were there have contracted coronavirus or COVID-19, and a few that have even died from it while incarcerated. Now, back in April 6, 2020, Governor Lujan Grisham presented that all individuals deemed by the New Mexico Correction Department will receive a gubernatorial commutation of the remainder of their prison sentence. Now, the people who fell into this category, persons whose release dates were no more than 30 days away, a necessary parole plan was in place that the person is not a sex offender, the person had not been convicted of felony DWI, and is not serving for domestic abuse, the person is not serving for assault on a peace officer, and a person is not serving for firearms enhancement related to something with their conviction. This list on its face appears to be fair to many, but there are, of course, additional complications. So even just thinking about this person not serving for assault on a peace officer, we've already watched across the country and what occurs with so many Black Americans across the country is that they are typically overbooked, or that the charge might be added on of assault of a peace officer that could prove to not be valid, or somehow was added in even though the person was not resisting arrest nor was causing a danger. So the category on its face can look fair, but as we continue to work with innocence and justice projects in New Mexico and throughout the country, how do we ensure that a person who is still incarcerated was not unlawfully incarcerated? That is a larger, bigger topic. But in particular, I thought the ACLU New Mexico has been very responsive in terms of arguing for the release of medically vulnerable women from Springer Correctional Facility, as a friend of the court for the work of Sandoval County in terms of determining who should be released, IPRA requests for ensuring that there's a lot of public information given about potential outbreaks in prisons. And something that also stood out to me is what the New Mexico Corrections Department has argued they are doing to ensure that the inmates who remain incarcerated are kept safe. They argued that they were suspending all inmate visitations. Each staff member was being medically screened before they began their shift at any facility. The inmates' weekly hygienic supply had been doubled at every facility. Interfacility transfers were limited to need-based only. Volunteer access had been suspended. Phone call access had been increased in all facilities, and inmates are being given one no-cost call per week. All inmates were provided with additional materials to communicate with family by mail. Outside work details were suspended. Family events, volunteer activities, inmate clubs, and banquets were postponed until further notice. But we've already watched the numbers that shows that even with these actions in place, and thinking about the civil liberties and rights of persons who have been incarcerated, that we're still seeing an increase in the rates of people that are incarcerated in terms of for contracting the disease. We think about these bigger concerns and the arguments made related to nonviolent definitions and misdemeanors for DV cases. Does that fall into the category or not? We want to always watch to see if our inmates have equal access to water to maintain cleanliness and work on hygiene. And what does solitary confinement look like in terms of this? This next to last category is, I think, very important because this was one of the very first concerns when people began to lose their jobs. When people are furloughed or lose employment, they're not going to be able to pay bills to cover the major parts of their lives: housing, utility, food, those spaces are going to be some of the most concerning places. And as national research has shown, coronavirus really had a really strong impact in terms of access to housing and potential home ownership as it relates to Black Americans and other communities, but not just for access to housing in terms of funds, but also in light of convictions. So this is a big area that New Mexico has been thinking about, and New Mexico Supreme Court moved pretty rapidly. You'll notice the dates for the Supreme Court's two orders, March 24th, 2020, and another one on March 26th, 2020, to address eviction for non-payment of rent cases. And these orders require judges throughout the state of New Mexico to stay or put a hold on evictions or cases where the tenant has shown the court that they were unable to pay rent. I think this is really critical, and it's very important. I'll have the links available for people to look at in terms of what is their right to protections. And if a landlord were to begin an eviction proceeding, the renter would receive a summons that notifies them of the lawsuit, explains their ways to participate, and then the process begins, but the people would not be evicted from their homes. The Bernalillo County Metropolitan Department is offering a free mediation program for people involved in active landlord-tenant cases in the court. And I'll have all of that information available for people to know for their resources to deal with that. Now, when we think about homes and housing, one of the first concerns that I remember reading about and studying was the concern of a rise of domestic violence as it relates to partner abuse or as it relates to child abuse. And this is a huge that we're watching because of the typical process required for a person to get a protective order. Historically, if you need a protective order related to domestic abuse, you needed to physically go to a location, you needed to physically sign an affidavit to file for that protective order. And how does one do that when you are required for everyone to stay in the house? How do we have moments when a person who is a victim of domestic violence can get away from the person who is abusing them? And how do we even explain any of this to a child who is in an unsafe position of their access to a space and access to life without abuse? So in the state of New Mexico, we do have a domestic violence resource center, which is a 24/7 hotline made available. But although reporting is down, the scholars and the researchers are noting that abuse is increasing and people's isolation is part of the reason for that. So I've said a whole lot of things because there are far-reaching implications about what our lack of access to public space has wrought. And so in terms of resources, I have these and actually a lot more that I will add related to it. So in terms of getting your ballot to vote, if any of these things bother you, number one, you should run for office. Number two, you're going to want to make sure that your vote is in place and it counts. And there's actually an electronic way, there's a way online in the state of New Mexico for you to start the process to become registered to vote. So I'll have that link available for you to access. Depending on your age, you can get access through the Senior Citizens Law Office that will provide a legal place for people to talk to someone if they are not receiving medical care or they need help receiving access to medical care. And that's the Senior Citizens Law Office. If you're having concerns about access to Medicaid and you're running into legal concerns about access to Medicaid, there's the legal aid for Medicaid right here in the city of Albuquerque that you can contact for those resources. If you are dealing with housing or evictions, depending on if you qualify, the New Mexico Legal Aid Office is available to provide legal assistance through that process. And remember, in the city of in Bernalillo County, there are mediators available to help you through that process. If you are a victim of domestic violence, New Mexico Legal Aid's domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking legal hotline is available for you to contact 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but it can get you access to your legal rights and explain the process. Once again, the Domestic Violence Resource Center is also available. And in terms of education, if you feel that your child has is not receiving an adequate education, a fair education, the Center on Law and Poverty is the law office that brought forward the Yazzie versus Martinez case, and they are available if you have concerns or legal concerns about education as it relates to our children. So I'm always going to remind you that although these are big organizations you can contact, there are actually places run by Black people that you can go to help you work through these. The Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated is available to help you with voter registration. So as opposed to just going to the link, you can also contact the AKAs, and they have a link available to talk with you through your voter registration and to answer all of your questions. The KWF Law Center for Social Justice and Change, where our own Pamela Herndon is the CEO, has shared that she is available and her office is available to help you walk through with a Black person in our community, eviction, domestic violence, kinship care, meaning you're a grandparent who needs to get legal rights to help with your grandchildren or others, access to voting concerns, if you know an incarcerated woman who is struggling with her rights to parent, as it relates to nursing and providing breast milk for her child. If you are dealing with disciplinary actions by schools, the KWH Law Center for Social Justice and Change is available to address all of those issues. Whew, I know I talk too much, but I hope that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the major issues that we're looking at and how we can deal with them in New Mexico. So I talked a lot, but I'm happy to chat with anyone and answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Professor Gibson Rankin, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. And I'm sure that many of our listeners will find something, if not many things, to be very, very helpful to them as we struggle with our day-to-day issues, particularly during this period. So before I pass this on to my colleagues, Tanya Covington and Jamal Martin and Sonia Smith, let me just give you a quick update on an announcement I made at the beginning of our podcast today. New Hope Full Gospel Church is doing a free food giveaway today. Originally, they planned to do it at noon. There was a delay in the truck that was delivering the food, so they pushed it back to 1 o'clock as the start time. So you can still get there, get your food if you need some food, but it's starting at 1 instead of at noon. So now let's go to the chat room and open this up for discussion. And I'm going to turn this section over to my colleagues, Tanya Covington and Jamal Martin, and Sonia Smith. You could certainly jump in here as well. And you will all take this section, okay?
All right, I'd just like to say thank you to Sonia. She always gives an amazing presentation. Lots and lots of information there that hopefully people will use. I know there have been lots of concerns about legal issues, and I'm so glad that you also talked about education and housing, because those are two areas I know where people have certainly had questions. And so again, as Sonia said, we will have that information put up for you, probably on the Office of African American Affairs website. And so that information will be available. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Jamal?
And if it's even faster, people can also throw it on Facebook or the other social media so people can have the links to use.
Thank you.
Sonia.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Oh, okay, with Sonia now. All right, right?
Okay, yeah, I did have one.
Okay,
That was
please go ahead.
brilliant, Professor Gibson Rankin. Thank you so very much. I work for the Department of Health, and so my focus and right now is on making sure that the minority community is getting tested. One of the questions that I'm always asked when I'm presenting to different entities is, do employers, or are they required rather to provide the PPE that's needed? One person argued with me and said, one business owner actually said, well, it's called personal protective equipment. So that means that my employee is responsible. And I said, I think you're wrong about that. But you know what? I'm not the legal expert, but I know somebody who is. So are employers required to provide PPE to their employees while they are during the function of their job?
No, I think that's an excellent question, and of course, I don't know the answer, but let me think it out loud. I'm not sure, and I'm going to turn it over to Pamela Herndon as a reference to find out about that. The best comparison I can think of might be related to public schools, right? There's a reason every parent knows to run to the local Walmart and snatch up as many Kleenex boxes and hand sanitizer as possible at the start of the school year, because the school doesn't provide that. The parents provide it so that the teachers can use it in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Along the lines of what that employer you're talking about kind of saying with PPE, sounds like a push off to me. But one might be able to argue that this is different than the typical cold or flu season, that there are other complications,
Mm-hmm.
and that the burden of the institution not providing it is less than there's different harm than typically possible. So I'm not 100% sure on that, but let me get in touch with Ms. Herndon and I'll get that information.
Okay.
That's very
Thank
good.
you so much. Okay, thanks. I'm done, Dr. Jamal.
Okay, thank you. It was a good question. Sonia Gibson Rankin. Thank you for sharing this information with us. I think my reflections on this really sort of takes me to look at things upstream and downstream as we talk about legal scholarship, but also too, in your first slide, you really sort of highlighted the issues of the social determinants of health and how the chronic stresses from those incidents or those endeavors really sort of lead to what Kimberly Crenshaw says, being Black is a pre-existing condition. And as we think about that, you know, the chronic suffering and stresses dealing with, you know, unequal access to care and voting and profiling and all the other things, those chronic stresses really do lead to the underlying conditions that so many of us have, which makes SARS 2.0 such a dangerous situation. I really liked how you when you talked about this. I hope people understand that this talk sort of reinforces the issues regarding systemic and institutionalized racism and what that means, and how SARS 2.0 exposes us to these vulnerabilities. So as we look at this, I have a couple of questions. And this may be something you want to talk to Pamela about also, too, Pamela Herndon about. Well, first, before I get to the question, I'll also say I love the formula: B is less than PL, and what that means with the SCOTUS and issues in terms of the burden of precautionary issues, because it really speaks to me in terms of forensic epidemiology. So here are my questions really now.
Before you give your question, Jamal, can I pre-respond to that part you mentioned about conditions? You know,
Sure.
in the law, we play with a reasonable person.
Exactly.
And the argument is that that's really being presented is a reasonable person wouldn't have gotten as sick as you did. But because of all the things you've outlined, that we Black Americans to have different physical makeups because of living as a Black person in this country, we're never going to fall into the reasonable person standard of all of the company we use.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because the reasonable standard brings to mind a lot of things that I want to talk about next in that sense, because their reasonableness basically says that we are biologically determined to be this way, and it is not. It is the socially toxic environment in which we live in that creates those conditions, and that's something we covered in the very first episode. So having said that, you know, one of the unreasonableness of the issues in terms of how the Constitution is interpreted, in terms of the Constitution guarantees the protection and the welfare of people, of citizens of the United States. And in that, I also see some issues where the UCC is in control of this also too, as we talk about Uniform Commercial Code and what that means. So we see all this institutional racism built up into all of this. So I'm just wondering that at some point, could you really sort of give our audience an overview of parens patriae, the Latin for, you know, public policy of the state, and issues of preemption for public health equity in terms of wearing masks, not wearing masks, and all the other issues, because these are all still governed by public health law in many ways, and people don't really see those connections, particularly when you bring up the UCC articles. So it's another moment for reflection about how public health law can be, you know, how we look at it from a different angle, can be used to articulate making changes, and how equity can flatten the curve.
So unfortunately, now you're getting me hyped, because now this is my family law stuff. I'm going to hold up a piece of paper with my handwriting where it looks like I've been ill, but this will at least help you understand what we think about with parens patriae, right? So forgive my handwriting, but I did.
No, I've seen the diagram. So yeah.
So I love this, and I use it when I teach family law. We've state, we've got a child, we've got parent 1 and parent 2, right? And the more we use this to think about custody issues and what parents,
exactly, custody battles,
things like that. But in
abuse.
reality, the state has a responsibility under the police powers for the health and welfare and safety of its citizens, which means the state determines what safety looks like.
Exactly.
They can determine what kind of t-shirts your child can or can't wear to school. The state can determine if we search lockers of students in the classroom. The state can determine that we have an age that a child should or shouldn't have access to cigarettes or vaping or things like that, right? So on this level, not just for children, but on some level, we also think about the health and welfare and safety of all the citizens. What is appropriate? That's why we have seatbelt laws. That's why we have helmet laws. That's why we'll have ideas about the tread of your tire and what is the appropriate standard. Or even in other states, not like ours, what kind of tint is allowed on the window of your car, because then it's not safe for police if your window tints are too dark. Those are all fall under parents' patria, right? This idea that the state is doing a notion to take care of its people. How does that play itself out? Well, it depends on who you vote into office, if they're going to fall in line with you on what is appropriate for a state to do or not do. This is good fun.
And I think
on
as we think about this again, that was exactly my point.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets to be complex with constitutional law and privacy law as to when does the state overstep in its quest to offer safety and start to infringe on our liberty and privacy. So I've got a smart device. This is a shout out to my daughter at Howard University, but I got a smart device that I take with me everywhere I go. And when I'm doing that, is it appropriate for the state to track me with contact tracing? Determine where I've been. Is that fair or appropriate? Well, any good Black person in America says no. No, you are not free to track me everywhere I go.
And the balance really, we're gonna have to, Sonia, we're running out of time. So you and I are gonna have to have a larger discussion about this because these are matters that really affect the public's life and equity. Yeah. And again, I'm glad you brought up the point about voting, because we cannot continue to be, voting malcontents and racists into office who formulate these laws that are embodied in the Constitution and the state laws, particularly as it deals with preemption. And what that means.
Every person you vote for, ask them this specific question in our state: what are you going to do for Black people specifically? Don't let them make it a people of color argument. Make them specifically state what they are going to do for Black people in this state. 2.9% doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
Aside from the usual nonsense. So, okay. Well, thank you, Sonia. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much. Dr. Martin, thank you for your insightful comments and questions as well. Tonya, thank you. Sonia, thank you. Dr. Gibson Rankin, thank you ever so much. Unfortunately, this brings us to the conclusion of our podcast. We encourage you, however, to check YouTube beginning tomorrow. It will be available and posted there so that you can check it at your leisure and at your convenience. And remember to go to the OAAA website, www.oaaa.nm.us, to find regular postings every day of important pieces of information that you should know about, including testing sites and schedules and updates on COVID and so many other things. So please stay in touch, and hopefully there'll be a turn of events and we'll be able to come back to you with more in the future. In the meantime,
Jim, can I add to that real quick?
Yes.
For our listeners, please ask them to call the governor's office and tell them to supply additional funding to continue this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the meantime, please stay safe, be well, and take care of one another.
Peace and love.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.